Brackeys Game Jam 2021.1 started on February 14th with the theme of Stronger Together, which was voted on by the community. I wanted recycling but bad, but c'est la vie, I guess. At any rate, on the morning of the 14th, I woke up and got started making a game for my very first game jam. My name is Satchmo, and this is how I made Comfort in 7 days. First, I opened Photoshop and started brainstorming. I used the pen tablet to write down my ideas so I could screen cap the process, but the weirdness of using a pad like that for the first time, combined with my horrendous handwriting, really didn't do me any favors. I was able to scribble down some ideas though. I started by looking up synonyms for the words stronger and together to see what directions I could take the game in that maybe weren't readily apparent from just the theme alone. I then tried to think of gameplay mechanics for both the notions of stronger and together. For instance, stronger could mean more HP, stamina, they could be faster, etc. And together could imply cooperative puzzles, gathering resources, amassing an army, and so on. After this, I apparently made some coffee, and then started developing the idea that I was most attracted to, which revolved around a character who has some amount of sanity that decreases if they are around enemies and increases as they collect comfort items. This idea pretty naturally led me to develop this character as a child, who was afraid of the dark and collected toys to make them feel safer and repel the surrounding darkness. I then listed the potential pros and cons of this idea to see if it was worth my time proceeding, or if maybe I should develop something else instead. As you can tell, I did ultimately go with this idea, but more on that at the end of the video. Next, I made a Trello board to try to keep myself organized, which it did, but I felt like I could have used that tool to my advantage a bit better during the process. After that, I used the Adobe Color tool online to try to get a palette decided on. I thought that the idea that I had come up with was inherently visual in nature, so while I would normally work on the art later in the process, I thought that getting the color and overall mood of the game locked in early would help guide other parts of the development process. I made a Photoshop file with a handful of colors that I liked and wound up using this file for the rest of the process. The next morning, I woke up and it was frozen outside, which here in Louisiana we were completely unprepared for. We lost power most of that day, and the internet was down for the next 2 days, which hampered my progress quite a bit. I didn't want to completely lose time working on the project, so I tried to do some manual pixel art while the power was down and come up with a character design. I also tromped around outside and recorded some of the sounds of me breaking icicles, stomping on the frozen ground, things like that, but in the end, none of these sounds made it into the game, unfortunately. When the power came back, I drew up the sketch in Photoshop, but wound up coming up with something that I thought was a lot better. I then threw the character into Unity and started working on making them move around and animating the walk cycle. This was my first time using Unity's tile system, so I had to fiddle around with that a bit to make it work, and that's really all I got done this day. On day 3, I started to consider the music in the game. Being a musician first and foremost, I figured this was the part of the process that would go the smoothest, and in retrospect, I think it was. I recorded a rough recording on my phone of an idea that I had, and this is what you're hearing in the background now. I first arranged this theme for string orchestra, but wanted to give it a creepier feel, so I did a second version of the theme with synthesizers and mandolin, which I was also happy with, but it actually didn't wind up making it into the final version of the game. I then did a third version of the theme, which started out as a toy box kind of thing, but when I started including orchestral percussion like marimba and glockenspiel, it changed into something a bit different. I really liked it, and this became the theme that plays during the actual game. I eventually decided to use the original string orchestra version as the menu music, as it would be the first thing the player heard, and it sounds the most impressive and grandiose. That was all I got done on day 3, unfortunately, and I was beginning to feel like I was falling behind a bit. I was happy to have music and art mostly taken care of, but there was literally no gameplay at this point, so on day 4 of 7, I finally got around to, yes, the lighting system, of course. I made a spotlight that followed around the player, and a few lights to dimly light the level. I lerped the intensity of the light to add a bit of interest and make the level not look so static. And while this was my first time using Unity's 2D lighting system, it wasn't too hard to figure out. Most of the issues were just including the correct namespaces and component names, which wasn't too hard to Google. I then started to work on moving between levels, so I hooked up a trigger to the door to change the scene when the player collides with the door. There were a bunch of problems with the way I wound up doing this, and while I managed to fix a lot of them later in the development process, a few disappointing things still made it into the final submission, but we'll talk about that later. The last thing I did on day 4 was to draw a coat rack to essentially be the enemy in the game. The original idea was to have various household items be enemies until they were revealed by the player's light, but that proved just too ambitious for me in this amount of time, so the coat rack is the only enemy that made it into the game. On day 5, I worked on the player's movement. Big lesson learned here. If you move your character by translation, as I was in the beginning, you get this jittery effect because the game is moving your character around in world space, then the physics engine takes over and pushes your character back if the colliders are overlapping. If you move your character via the rigid body, that is, with the physics engine, it detects that you are trying to move into a space where your character can't be and just forbids it, which is a huge improvement. I'm writing this after having played some of the other submissions in the Game Jam, and this is actually something I'm noticing a lot of other devs doing, moving their character around by translation, that is. I've been making a point to leave a comment when I see them to help them out. I'm sure there's a time and place for both methods, but for me, this was a huge improvement and wound up correcting a few bugs where you could fall right through the map. I don't think I managed to screen cap a lot of day 6, but mostly what I got done was adding a light to the coat rack once the player revealed it that marked the object as being safe, and I drew a teddy bear that would become the player's comfort object. Again, I wanted there to be many toys that the player would collect, but the teddy bear was the only thing that made it into the game. Day 7 was the biggest day for me, and I'm assuming this is probably the case for a lot of the developers, as time is quickly running out. I had built what I thought was a pretty solid foundation with the concept, the art, the music, a few assets, the lighting system, the player's movement, and even a couple of levels, but there was still no real gameplay nor any UI, so I still had quite a lot to do. Looking back, I don't know why I decided to do the menu first, when I probably should have, worked on making it a game, but I did the menu first anyway, which I think turned out pretty well in the end. Honestly, I don't think it was a bad decision to do the menu at this point. You see, I was dead set on finishing the game, and that to me was the most important thing. So while the character wouldn't have much to do in the game if it were released at this state, at least the game would load up and let you click play, which to me made it feel like more of a finished product. I spent quite a while on the menu screen getting all of the buttons to work and whatnot, then I worked on making a few new levels. I already had a foundation in place. I found Unity's tile system pretty easy to use, so it was just a matter of drawing a few more interesting levels. Now I can't believe I forgot to screen cap this, but after the levels were in place and I added the doors and lights, I redid the character sprite with the help of my wife to make it look more like a child in pajamas that was holding a candle, which made the light source emanating from them make a lot more sense. I also added a win and lose screen and a simple check to make sure that you had revealed all the coat racks, and I was done. The game now had an objective, a win condition, a lose condition, and UI. It took me a little while to get the build settings just right and to get it to upload to itch properly, but I did, and the game was finally submitted. While I show off a bit of the gameplay here, I'll mention a few takeaways from this project. First, it was important for me to actually finish this project, and it feels incredibly rewarding knowing that I did. And finishing is really the point of game jams anyway, so my advice to anyone interested is just that. Focus primarily on finishing the project, and leave the details for later. Second, and more specific to this game, is that I learned a lot about how to move things around using the 2D rigid body. I learned a bit more about scene management, including when and how to use the don't destroy on load method. And unfortunately, after release, I learned a lot about singletons, which would have fixed the biggest bug that persists in the submitted version of the game right now, where you can get multiple players on the screen at once. And third, while I was careful to keep scope creep in mind while conceiving the game, I still managed to be too ambitious with what I wanted the game to be. Ultimately, I do feel like I managed to pare back some of the elements whilst I was making the game, but it was still ambitious for me given the time frame, so my advice is to not be afraid to eliminate or change elements of your game during development. You can always revisit them later. While I was doing this project, I tracked my time when I remembered using Toggle, and here is the data for that. While I'm sure these times aren't 100% accurate, they still give a good impression of where I spent my time. I managed to work on the project for 28 hours over the course of the week. Ideally, I would have spent a lot more time on the project, so that will be a focus for next time. Obviously, programming is the lion's share here, but it's interesting that for every hour I spent programming, I actually spent 45 minutes doing something else, so I think that's a very important takeaway. While it seems like programming is all you do as a solo game dev, there's clearly a lot of time spent on other aspects. At least, that was the case for me. I think if I had it my way, that playtest and bug fix bar would be a lot bigger, and I would like to get the time programming to not be so disproportionately large, but a lot of that comes down to figuring out Unity and the systems that I'm not familiar with, like the 2D lighting and the tile map. The voting period for the game lasted 2 weeks, and in that time I reviewed a ton of games. I won't include that process here, but if anyone's interested, I could definitely do a video about some of the other submissions in the jam. Anyway, here are my scores for comfort. I'm really quite proud of them actually. First off, audio scored pretty high, which I'm really happy with since I feel like I'm most skilled as a musician. However, the audio category also includes sound effects and the like, and my game doesn't include any of that. So 3.5 is a really solid score all things considered. Overall, I placed 645 out of almost 2,000 submissions, and this is really good I think. Fun placed rather low, and that's entirely understandable as I don't think I managed to convey the core gameplay well, and a lot of people were confused as to what they were actually meant to do. This, combined with some of the game-breaking bugs, makes the 2.6 score completely reasonable, if not entirely generous. Anyway, that's my devlog of comfort. I'm really happy with the project despite the bugs and the mistakes. I managed to finish the game, and that's all I really wanted to do. Thanks to Brackeys for hosting the Game Jam and teaching me most of what I know about Unity, my wife for all of her help and support during the week, my friends and family in Discord who gave me feedback during the process, and thank you for watching. Feel free to ask me any questions or come hang out with me and my wife Victoria on Twitch or on Discord. Relevant links are in the description. Cheers.